Comrades, I guess you can all hear me because of the room.
Yeah, there's no sound, so people should know that. This is just for the video. This is for video.
When I selected these two 45 to 65, I really didn't know what I was getting into. And let me preface my remarks because I'm not going to deal with what I'm telling you now. I didn't realize the events were so titanic in a way. It was the end of the 30s and the preparations for a war. There was a recession in 38 and 39. Then the war preparations, which started with Pearl Harbor in December 41. Then after the war, there was the issue of the Korean War a number of years later, starting in 50 to 53. Then there was the whole question of the Soviet Union had fought in the war and had big impact both with the Cold War and the support for the Soviet Union that went all the way to freed Auschwitz and went all the way to Berlin. So, and then there was the question of the Kennedy assassination in '62, and then in '65 they started the war. Now, these are events of monumental importance that do play into the consciousness of the workers and the labor movement as a whole and the population. But I don't think it's appropriate for me to go into that except as how it plays out inside the labor movement. Now, what my intention, my objective is to raise a question and then prepare an analysis of it. And the question is this: how is it possible that from the glorious years of the Depression, the rise of the sit-downs, the general strikes, the birth of the CIO, and all the struggles that took place over those years, how is it possible that it faded away and got lost in the history and the tradition of the AFL and the CIO that was separate? That is a big question. What happened to those wonderful years? Everybody writes about them. Every history book has them. Whether they're labor or you go to college or you go to school, you'll know about the 30s. That's what we're going to struggle to discuss today. How did it happen? Okay. Now, just to review for all of us, what was our objectives in the previous classes that we related from the labor movement to the relationship to a communist perspective? What were we dealing with, and how are we trying to intervene to develop these principles? First, the industrialization of the workers was a big issue even before the 30s. That goes back to the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. The second thing was the independence of the labor movement from the two parties and from the bourgeoisie itself. How to build an independent, class-wide movement. The IWW tried it. There was developments even in the 20s and 30s. And then there was the issue of defense of the Soviet Union and how to elevate the workers here to understand the nature of a socialist system. and how to defend it. And then finally, how to build unity, black and white, Latino, and other people of color, unity within the labor movement. Those were the four objectives. We discussed them to some extent, saw the strengths and weaknesses that emanated from the labor movement in the previous classes. So what I'd like to start out with is just briefly giving a statistic to remind us of what happened in the 30s. There were 17,862 strikes involving 8.5 million workers between 1933 and 1939.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah. 17,862 strikes involving 8.2 million, yeah, go ahead for a moment, I may need it later, million workers between 1933 and 1939. 32.5% of the entire workforce from the Depression to 1950, 32.5% were in unions. How much is it in now?
8.3.
The private sector. 12 something with the public sectors. How did this happen? That's okay. Now, and then of course, the reason I'm raising the importance of these strikes, and I'll repeat other strikes that took place as we go down, is because of something Lenin wrote in 1895 in a series of essays called On Strikes. He called a strike an education in revolution, not the revolution itself. It was the school that workers would go through in the process of getting a revolutionary consciousness. And he developed it, saying it's not the revolution itself because it needed more than a labor movement to make a revolution. It needed a people's movement. So that strikes are very, very important in our analysis of the changes that are developed as we go through these decades. And also, if those ever of you read the history of the Russian Revolution, which is quite extensive and thick, you'll see that in the introduction, Leon Trotsky makes note of how many strikes existed right before the revolution that Lenin was very much aware of in 1913, even before November, that prepared the party for a revolutionary possibility of seizure. One possibility. It's more, I wish it was as simple as that, but. So let me go on, because I'll bring up some other strikes as we get down the road. Now, the rise of the CIO during that period was very, very important, and was the leverage for this development that broke with the AFL, who were conservative, class collaboration, and leaned only toward craft unionism, which would be the catering to the aristocracy of white labor. The CIO was the instrument for the development of this revolutionary perspective that led to strikes. And Roosevelt, who became president in 1932, saw the revolutionary potential and immediately got involved with the CIO, and also was an instrument that was given the credit for all the progressive legislation that took place during that period, because he was a cunning, and he was no Bush. See? So that what happened as these revolutionary developments took place, Roosevelt went along to a large extent, patting the CIO and its development on the back, with some reservations. He had to watch his ruling class at the same time. But in 1938 and 39, a recession set in. And Roosevelt began to take a little, carefully done, a harder line against the CIO. He wasn't bothering about the AFL. They were in his pocket, in big business's pocket. But how did he do it? How did he do it? He didn't attack the CIO in 38 and 39. He catered to the weakest elements in the CIO. And who were the weakest elements in the CIO? The weakest elements in the CIO were not the industrial sector, steel, auto, the miners, the rubber workers, and all the affiliated industrial workers that centered around these major industries.
Can we just a second? If there are people, once you come in, we can set up chairs. Yeah.
Why don't we move the table back?
Okay.
Great.
We're gonna have to change the lid guy. Yeah. Can somebody move some of these chairs over here?
Oh, thank you.
There's 2 seats over here. There's two extra seats here. There's chairs here.
Why don't you sit here, read, Nina, and then he don't have. Industrial sector, which was the miners, the steel and auto, which were all organizing committees that were forming their internationals. And John L. Lewis was the head of the CIO. Who were these unions that he began to maneuver with? It was the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, led by a David Dubinsky, who was a socialist without teeth. As the weakest, yeah, I shifted to the weakest. Okay.
Dubinsky in the CP?
No, SP, but the right wing of the SP, if there is a. Then there was the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. The leader was someone named Sidney Hillman.
Oh, yeah.
And then there was the International Typographers Union, which was not a big player. And there was one more, because 4 of the original, I believe it's 4 of the original 7 architects that set up the Committee of Industrial Organizations Committee before the actual CIO was formed, broke. 4 of the 7 broke away under the Roosevelt's pulling them away and offering them some goodies and bringing them closer to his position as preparations were being made for the Second World War. So that by 1940, there was already a split in the CIO. Some of them had even gone over, like Dubinsky, to the AFL Crafts. Others waited a little bit before they decided to go, including Sidney Hillman from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. 1940 was an interesting year. It was interesting because it was the year before Pearl Harbor, and while the CIO had weakened, there was big struggles yet to develop in 1940. 1940, there were two strikes that I would like to deal with because there were many strikes, but two that had particular importance. One was Ford Motor Company, who for years, even when the organizing campaigns of the 30s were successful, said, it'll be over my dead body if there was going to be a union here. Now, what was his plan that kept the UAW that had already begun to break through General Motors, as we discussed, with the sit-down strike of 1937? How is it possible that Ford was able to hold out until 1940, 41? Good. He was paying $5 a day wage, and who was he paying them to? All the black workers who were coming and migrating to the north in search of jobs. He had hired. He had approximately, in the Dearborn plant, which was the big one that the UAW wanted to organize because it actually had rolling mills in Dearborn, and they made their own steel. Sorry?
Nothing, my grandfather worked there.
Oh, well, approximately 17,000 black workers were recruited into Ford. And he felt that there was no question that they would be strike breakers, that they would cross the lines, because it was obvious that he, not only did he feed them the way you described, $5, but he also spent millions of dollars in the black community. He bribed black ministers. He hired famous sports, black sports athletes. He spent a lot of money catering to the black community as well. So the UAW, in preparing for a struggle, had to take this into consideration right away. And they did have communist organizers that understood the nature of how to build black and white unity, and began to educate the white workers that they were preparing for strike not to attack or use any epithets against black workers who might have decided to scab. Secondly, they organized an interracial council for strategizing, and they hired black organizers, which primarily came out of the Communist Party and had some experience in the sit-downs of the late 30s. And that was the process that began. That how would this turn out if it turned out to be a black-white violent confrontation, or a potential of building unity in order to unionize Ford Motors. Ford had one other thing going for him. He had an army of thugs hired by the company. Harry Bennett, who was a vice president of the company, was the organizer. And they had thousands of them working in the plant. They were spying, they were attending meetings, and they were also physical and violent, fingering the organizers inside the plant who were trying to win the workers. They couldn't at the beginning. The organizing campaign started with house calls. That's all they could do at the beginning. But then they slowly but surely penetrated the plant. It was the largest Ford plant in the country. Weeks went by, and they began to recruit more and more. I think they totaled around 5,000 of workers, which included now the beginning of black workers, as well as white workers. But Ford wouldn't yield. Meanwhile, the government had passed certain progressive legislation, like the National Labor Relations Act, and the union leaders were using that to the hilt, even just to be able to hand out a leaflet or wear a button in the plant. And that struggle was won, which was a very significant step, just to wear a button that said organize in the union without being fired or physically attacked. But the UAW leaders hesitated for a strike as to when to call a strike, and the government, Roosevelt came in, and he was preparing the war by 1941 and 2, so he had his hand in it, and it kept getting delayed and delayed. But finally, the rank and file, just like through the 30s, they called the shots. The strike took place. There was some violence by the Bennett thugs. 1,500 black workers out of the thousands stayed inside the plant. And the question was how to deal with them in regard to getting a contract, because Ford held out. Little by little, living inside a plant 24 hours a day is not a happy day. And they began to get more and more resistant, and more began to come out. And as they come out, the cheers would be incredible. That strengthened the unity. And so, ultimately, Ford signed an agreement. The union came in, and you know the history of that. This was a tremendous development for black and white unity inside the labor movement. At the same time, in 41, steel became a center. Now, the steel industry had also hired a lot of black workers into the furnaces, the lower paying jobs. And by the way, the same thing existed in Ford. It wasn't that there was equal pay. That had to be another struggle. The two-tier system did exist for black workers, even with the settlement of the Ford and the UAW, which turned out to be unfortunate. But there was a term we call in steel, Little Steel. I worked for a company in Little Steel. It was Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, Inland Steel, were considered, in comparison to U.S. Steel, Little Steel. But they refused to sign a contract when U.S. Steel signed on 2 years earlier, especially after the sit-down strikes. John L. Lewis walked right into the Benjamin Fairless, and Fairless said, I think we could settle it, because the heat of the sit-downs, John L. Lewis used to the hilt. But when it came to Little Steel, you might remember historically about the Memorial Massacre in South Chicago, the Republic Steel. It's a historic massacre where the cops and sheriffs and National Guard charged a parade of strikers with children and wives and so on, who were celebrating Memorial Day but they were on strike. So they decided to march to the gates, and then they got the hurl of guns and bullets and clubs, and at least 11 workers died, and many, many were injured. So it was the 1937 massacre that led the Little Steel, particularly led by Republic, to think that they could never they would never fight for a contract. There wasn't a steel union. It was called the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, led by Phil Murray, who later became head of the CIO. But so in 40 and 41, with this new development in Ford, Little Steel decided to give in after a few days and give the steel workers a contract, although there was a battle in Youngstown, Ohio on the bridge when a march was confronted by sheriffs and cops. Well, these two strikes were the last call for a moment, because when Pearl Harbor happened in December of 41, the patriotism was incredible that enveloped the workers. And the CIO, including the stronger unions, completely gave in to Roosevelt and adopted the war plans of the Roosevelt administration when they entered into the Second World War in 1942. Now, there's an interesting development that I'd also like to mention, that while the patriotic frenzy was going on, the workforce of the Second World War was changing. All the men were going to fight. Millions were drafted and enlisted. And the workforce became more black and women. And they had a different take, whether from good naivete or what. But they were fighting, in a fighting mood, when the war started. Or right after the war started, I should say. So there was already the changing character of a workforce that many, many years later, based on the technological changes, we saw a kind of an embryo here. Because what happened was, and I always like to mention strikes, the amount of strikes, there were 4,288 strikes involving 2 million workers. And it was only surpassed by the 1937 upsurge of the workers.
What year is this?
1942. 1942, and yeah, 42. Now, there was something that was going on at the same time that was a factor in all this. And once again, statistics tell us a lot. In the course of the war, which of course ended in 45, 11,880,000 workers were either killed or injured on the job in this country. 11 times more than all the GIs who died in the Second World War. So you can imagine what the productivity level was that created all the profits, the productivity, and the ability of the U.S. to export not only the GIs and the Navy personnel, but also the goods and services that were produced that led to so many injuries. And this was in one of the handbooks, handbooks of labor statistics, and it's in, I believe, Labor's Untold Story. So the war years, while they were filled with frenzy of patriotism, there was this undercurrent that was developing that saw that the war wasn't solving the problems for the workers. Why? First, the CIO and the AFL, as well as the CP at the time that Hitler invaded Soviet Union, and I have to say a few words on that in a minute. They all supported the no strike pledges. They all supported the wage freezes. They all supported these productivity, inhuman speed-ups. And they also supported the fact that if you wanted to leave a job to go to another, because of the terrible conditions, you couldn't. You were frozen in the industry or in the workplace. So that all these factors were beginning to have an undercurrent to the workers. The leaders were all for, including the CP, which then began to lose some of its credibility. But there was an interesting twist to this. In 1940, wait a minute, I can't get the year exactly right, but you'll know the event. It was the Hitler-Stalin Pact. 39, that's right, 39. Now, when the Hitler-Stalin Pact took place, the CPs around the world were told to fight your own government, not to enter into the war. In other words, they became more anti-imperialist, the CP, for that period. And during that period, they were getting support from the workers who didn't want to go to war. They weren't for entering into Europe. There was a current for pacifism and isolationism to a large extent. So there was a sort of, the CP was in a kind of a good position to encourage workers not to support the war. But then Hitler in 1942 invaded the Soviet Union. Germany, the Nazi Germany, invaded the Soviet Union a year later. So the Communist Party then became the best supporters to defend the war. And it took place within a year. And by that time, with a lot of black workers and women in the industries, the CP was supporting all the exploitation because the slogans were, win the war, win the war, win the war. And they used to have quotas on how many good products you produced. Each shift would show how much they can do better. Now, between 1945, December, the war ended in Europe. I'm sorry. The war ended totally in August of 1945, when Truman, who became president after Roosevelt died in the middle of his third administration, fourth, dropped the A-bomb. See? And so the war ended in August of 45. And interestingly enough, as soon as the war ended, there was a tremendous upsurge of workers who, feeling they had been suffering under all these years of the war, they came out in struggle and strikes. As a matter of fact, in 1945, just personally, is when I met Sam Marcy, who invited me to a picket line in uniform down at Western Union that was in a big strike in Lower Manhattan. The figures of the 1945 45, 45, 45. I don't have them on this sheet, but I'll have them before the end of in my other remarks. So let me go on. But they were as many as the 1937 upsurge of the workers. For that short period, as a matter of fact, I have it. In 1945 and 46, there were 4,740 strikes involving 1,861,000 strikers for a total of 28,425,000 women-man days of work lost right after the war. Okay, there's some more statistics, but that gives you a clue as to how this upsurge. But by 46, Truman was reelected in 40. Truman was reelected in 48. Now that was an important election for us to analyze. Truman had already showed his hand in regard to the CIO and the AFL regarding not the way Roosevelt did it, but he had a more anti-union approach. But the election of 1948 was important, without going into details, because there was a break in the two-party system. Henry Wallace, who had once been a vice president of the Roosevelt administration in the first administration, decided to go independent on the basis that the anti-Soviet feeling was so strong after the Second World War that he was concerned, and so were many others, that the U.S. was preparing a war against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had swept all the way to Berlin and decided after the war ended in Europe to send their troops to Asia, which was Manchuria and other places, which just frightened the bourgeoisie here as a reason, in my judgment, for why they dropped the bomb. The other reason why they dropped the bomb, in my opinion, was the signal for the beginning of the Cold War. That's, in my judgment, when they dropped that bomb, the labor movement in this country was going to be under attack. So when Truman decided to run against, and some newspapers said he lost to Dewey, their headlines that he had lost because Wallace was taking the votes away from his Democratic base. But what happened was a split deepened in the CIO, because there was the left-wing unions like United Electrical Workers, Mine Mill and Smelter, and some of the other progressive and left-wing unions that supported Wallace. And I was active myself in those days in the Wallace movement and saw the tensions that arose inside the labor movement. So they were expelled, the CIO under Murray, because Lewis was so hostile to Roosevelt that he made a serious mistake, John L. Lewis, that cost him, in my judgment, his influence ultimately in the labor movement. He was so hostile to Roosevelt that he supported Dewey in the 1944 election. 48, Truman ran. In 48, Truman ran for president and won against Dewey. So when he, instead of organizing an independent union, a labor movement or a labor party or whatever, he supported He supported someone named Wilkie, Wendell Wilkie. I mean, Roosevelt just swore Wendell Wilkie. I don't think he even got one of those electoral votes, maybe 3 or 4. And Lewis was unfortunately caught. He resigned from the CIO, and then he used the mine workers for his base primarily in the years later. By the way, I meant Wilkie, not Dewey. So by 1948, Truman came in. He was already in office because Roosevelt died. And he was instrumental in supporting the Taft-Hartley law. See, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley law was passed. Now, he was very clever. He still needed labor support, so he put a formal veto on it, but didn't do a thing to organize any resistance to the Taft-Hartley. And it was obvious that he wanted the Taft-Hartley because starting in 1948, when he won, Wallace only got over 1 million votes, which was low because of the labor vote shifted due to the role of the CIO and the AFL, and there was only a small group of unions, left-wing unions, that supported Wallace. As soon as the Taft-Hartley was passed, he initiated 11 injunctions against all the labor strikes that began to develop in his administration that went from 1948 to 1952. And I just wanted to read what the AFL-CIO, what the Taft-Hartley was all about. They, in its initial introduction, and I took this from the Taft-Hartley law, it stated, certain practices by some labor organizations, their officers and members, have the intent, the necessary effect of burdening or obstructing commerce by preventing the free flow of goods in such commerce through strikes and forms of industrial unrest, or through concerted activities which impair the interests of the public in the free flow of commerce. Now everything has to do with commerce. See? The elimination of such practices is a necessary condition. See? What the Taft-Hartley did, it destroyed really, to a large extent, the National Labor Relations Act. It undermined all the most progressive legislation that came out of that act. We used to call they call it the labor's rights. I forget the title, but anyway, it was a very important act because the Supreme Court had overturned the earlier 7A Act of the National Industrial Relations Act. The Supreme Court called it unconstitutional, so the National Labor Relations Act replaced it. What it did, it had anti-communist provisions, including loyalty oaths. It paved the way for unions to raid each other now. Left unions were fair game now for indictments and imprisonment of union leaders. It eliminated secondary boycotts. And it began the expansion of the right to work laws that flooded the South and stopped the organizing campaigns of the CIO and to a lesser extent the AFL, called Operation Dixie. It just ended, see, the effort to organize the South. And that's where we're at even today in regard to our own cadres and comrades who are working in the South. Well, I'll move on to Yes, sure.
Because in the very beginning, you said, how in the world is it possible for us to have gone from 35% or so
Yes.
down to 12?
Yes.
What was the function? So I just want to make a comment about this Taft-Hartley and this particular time period, which is not just from Taft-Hartley, but also the loyalty owes the creation of the CIA to the NSC, whatever the number it is that created the CIA. And even like in New York State in the year 1948 when they passed the Feinberg Law, which kicked communists out of the and which was then adopted as kind of a policy across the country against progressive teachers. And Rakuder, and all the things that were going on with the un-American activities and the Hollywood 10. And that is that the significance of ideology and propaganda and the methods whereby they were able to, win the minds and hearts of the people of the United States against left-wing thought. Because here these people were very much in favor of supporting the USSR during the war, and many, many people were very pro-labor before the war, and even during, as you pointed out. So the significance of controlling people's minds was very, very clear to them, and not clear to the people in the United States. Well, and the fact is that, for example, the Communist Party went underground. Leaders of it went underground because, as you said, even in the Taft-Hartley, if you were a communist, you weren't allowed to be even representing from the floor of your factory. They were not allowed to have communists in any form of leadership at all. And so the question is, how come everybody just sort of like plopped into this mentality? Which is, a conundrum, because we have to face it now too. What makes people just sort of like accept something which is at odds with what is their own needs? And I'm just going to make a suggestion, and that is that the double shock of the Depression, which had such deleterious effects on people and made them fearful and upset and angry, and then World War II, which ended in the most horrendous way of this atomic bomb, these two atomic bombs, and then the revelations of what happened in the concentration camps, made people have difficulty understanding reality. And it was the perfect thing for the U.S. government to be able to reorganize their perceptions of reality. And the right wing has a very clever way of doing that. They did it way back during World War I when they created the Committee for Public Information. They know how to control people's minds. And that's, in other words, if your mind is at odds with your material reality, because here the workers were suffering, and they were striking, and they were angry, and suddenly, boom, they're willing to go along with this whole anti-communist crusade, which is how then they could do something like stop the organization drive in the South and make, for the most powerful leaders of the various unions around the country, and other things too, teachers, etc., just shut them up. So I think it's not just we look at material reality, but also how the government, the leaders, the people who came up with these ideas, these thinkers, these nefarious thinkers, Donovan, say, were so powerful in controlling people's minds.
Well, that's very... and as a matter of fact, it intensified after Truman, after the election of 1952, when Eisenhower became president. To add to what you're saying, I don't know, there's some of us might know this, but the period that you're discussing, the workers and the people in general really believed that the Soviet Union was going to bomb the U.S. That's how the propaganda paralyzed the North American working class. I remember children being trained to go under desks. Oh, Molly just raised. It was so powerful, and then to add to it, that paralyzed it. The Soviet Union, in defending itself, built the Sputnik. See, the Sputnik. Now, what was the Sputnik? See, the Sputnik was the most powerful nuclear weapon that shocked the U.S. imperialists. that they could come up with a bomb, a rocket bomb, whatever. What was a what?
It's satellite.
Satellite. It was already a satellite.
They had the power to.
But the question is, you talk about paralysis of mind, but it was based upon a material conception of the ruling class that controls all the media. How could the workers have avoided it? Where was the voice? The left was undermined. The left CP was already under attack with indictments. They went to jail under the Smith Act. And this is very important because in 1940, it was the Trotskyists that went to jail under the Smith Act. But nobody supported the Trotskyists during the 1940 witch hunt under Roosevelt. And why? Because the CP thought Stalin had already come to power. And the CP was gung-ho against the Trotskyists, the left-wing opposition that was destroyed.
They went in jail because they were opposed to war.
They opposed the war.
Right.
And who got arrested and jailed? It was the leaders of the Minneapolis strike, general strike. They were the main leaders of the strike. Roosevelt knew what he was doing. He was jailing the union leaders in the name of the Smith Act. Nobody came to the support of the Trotskyists. But when the CP was jailed, the party that we were in went to support the CP. We went to see in Buffalo ourselves to see John Noto.
What year is this now? When did they start jailing the CP?
They jailing the CP?
Which year? Yeah. I'm just trying to keep it.
Yeah, I know. It's important to keep the continuity.
Because you were.
I think it was. It had to be 1952,
Okay.
around 52, because I didn't get to Buffalo till 50 and 51, 50. Yes.
A little quick point was the fact that, see, what had happened with the Nazis, with the concentration camps, and the U.S. government was able to make people make an association with totalitarianism from Hitler and Nazism to carry over and to make people convince them that communism was also a dictatorship. They can kind of pair that into one another, so people got the idea that communism was similar to fascism and that they were interchangeable, because they didn't understand anything about what communism, its view or vision was. They had no idea about that. But they made they were having control of the instrument of communications, allowed the bourgeoisie here to make that, just push them together and make them into one. So that was also another thing that they used against educating Americans.
Right. And then finally, the electrocution of the Rosenbergs. See? The electrocution of the Rosenbergs sent a powerful, chilling message to the left.
53.
See? Except for us. See? And the CP, to a large extent, that did come out, although the CP was disbanded itself under Earl Browder. They disbanded a party under the witch hunt and the McCarthy period. I mean, when you think of the McCarthy period, you don't think only of by the way, he got elected in 1948, McCarthy. So that, or with his election, that sprung loose a whole neo-fascist movement as well as that went with the witch hunt. They passed the not only the Taft-Hartley, they passed the McCarran Act, which you can expel. For example, take the ILWU. The leader of the ILWU was who? Harry Bridges. He was an Australian. See? Harry Bridges was up for eviction and for expelling him from the country on the basis of the McCarran Law. Then it was the Walters, I have it down here. It's I'm sorry? The McCarran Law, but then there was an immigration, another law that was passed. Huh? McCarran Walters. So all these things, they were real. It wasn't imagined by the labor movement. See, in addition to what Heather is saying, when you put those together, there was a reality to this witch hunt. Subversive squads? I mean, they traveled the country. They came to Buffalo. They came all over to Chicago. They traveled. They wiped out every progress. By the way, they wiped out even the left who weren't nothing to do with the CP. They went wild. They really did. Starting with 1952, it added it. And Eisenhower, he was a general and a big business representative. Wall Street put him in. As a matter of fact, what they did with Eisenhower, starting in 1952, a little before that, I believe, they made him president of Columbia University to give him some intellectual standing.
Rockefeller, Nelson drew him.
Of course. See? This is how they operate. So then he became president. But what's interesting about his presidency was that it did slow down the class struggle while it intensified what we're talking about. Why? Is because it was an expansion of the economy. The Korean War was on. It was big time. In steel, where I was working, they were giving you money if you can find somebody that they would work to work in Bethlehem Steel. They went all south, all over the country, sending for recruits to come into the plants. So what happened in addition to that expansion was that the ruling class recognized that this great military leader would be best if he ended the war in Korea. It was going badly, the Korean War. See, they needed a way out. It was a standoff. So what happened is the war ended in 1953 with many, many casualties, of course, and deaths. What? Yeah. So by So by 1953, as the war ended, the class struggle was dying down. It was. We were getting increases, except for one period in 1952, which I'll wait for a discussion, because it involved Truman seizing our plant in order to stop a strike, which is important during the course of a democratic president in seizing plants, which Roosevelt had done earlier too. But what happened in 1955 is important, because the weakness of the labor movement was so obvious to both the AFL and CIO that feelers went out to merge. See? To merge the AFL with the CIO. And in 55, Eisenhower was for it. Why? Is because George Meany, who was president of the AFL and who had once boasted, more than once, that he had never been on a picket line in his life. This is a labor leader. He felt confident. Eisenhower felt confident as long as he became the head of the AFL-CIO merger. Walter Reuther, who had led the earliest strikes but had moved to the right, particularly in regard to the Communist Party, in purging them from the UAW during the years we're talking about, Reuther was willing to accept a lesser role as head of the CIO, and they formed the Industrial Union Congress as a section of the AFL-CIO in 1955. Now, I'm getting close to 65, right? Huh? Well, yeah. That's why I really bit off a lot. Well, the only thing I want to end on. Oh, good, good, good.
Give you a chance to check.
Yeah, I want to just. That was the merger. This is by a delegate. These delegates, as I observed them in the sessions, are several times removed from the workers who make up at the time the 15 million membership of this new labor body. To any serious student of the labor movement or to any dedicated unionist, composition of the convention, the type who set the pattern, is of prime importance. Almost to a man, the delegates are paid functionaries many years away from the trade or industry they presumably represent today. Indeed, even those who worked in some distant past can claim special distinction from many whose hands had never touched a tool or a machine in production. Now, I read that. Labor's Untold Story.
No, but you said at the beginning this is from a conference.
Oh, yeah, the convention of the AFL-CIO, the first convention, where the delegates met to ratify the merger. Now, I raised that not because we didn't support it, but we all felt that the merger laid the basis for a potential in spite of the leaders. And to some extent, it proved true in two areas, and I'm going to draw it to an end now. I was involved in the 1959 strike in Bethlehem Steel, in all steel, which went on for 116 days, 4 years after the merger of the AFL-CIO. And it was an important strike, not because it was bloody or confrontational, because the steel barons had really prepared for this strike. They had loaded up all warehouses around the country with finished steel or steel that was a bit more basic, wire and other production that came out of steel. The reason why the 116-day strike was important was because it really, as the events unfolded, it gave a clue as to what the future would be in the steel industry. Because we had never worked a full year in steel. Either we were on strike or we were laid off due to overproduction. But what happened in 1959 is a whole new technology entered the industry that we knew but didn't think it affected the strike. It was called cybernation. See, the merger of machinery, see, through an automated process. For example, if you worked in a pulpit in steel, looking down on how steel got rolled, just like a member of your family might roll dough to make a bread or a cookie, that's the way steel was rolled when it came out of ingot form or out of a slab. And you had primarily all men on the floor operating these tremendous machines that would draw out the steel like you would use a roller and draw it out for refrigerators, cars, name it, and gauging it for the customer. Well, by 1959, already organized, where you take a perforated card, where you're up in a pulpit, and you put it in something. I never worked in a pulpit. And the jaws would open and close without men adjusting the gauge. Eliminated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of workers. The second thing that happened is called basic oxidizing furnaces, BOFs, that eliminated blast furnaces and open hearts and coke ovens. All the processes of an integrated steel plant that led to the making of a steel. Now you took a pellet, a certain kind of pellet, and you put it into a furnace under tremendous, tremendous pressure and blasts of oxygen. And that was steel. You would have pig iron steel. You would have steel. Thousands and thousands of workers. And that's what the issue was. It wasn't over a contract. It was over the future of the steel industry. And as you know, in retrospect, there is no. The rust belts are all over. Bethlehem and Lackawanna has got grass, covered 5 miles. Now all it is grass. Pittsburgh there's no steel. Anyway, so I say that because it gives you a clue as to how Marxists must analyze every phenomena to get a grasp of the reality of bourgeois production and class relationship. It was a strike, but did anybody talk? We talked about whether we were going to get a nickel more, or the incentives were going to be changed, or some of the classifications might be adjusted. That was what was on the table. The other strike I'd like to end on is closer to my mind in a way. It's 1199. And when I see Ann and Nina here, I feel it's very appropriate. Now, in 1959, there was a 46-day strike that started in the hospital and nursing homes over basic organizing. Who ever could think of hospitals being organized? What are you doing, said the major press and bourgeois. You're hurting sick patients. Your life is healing. You're going to strike against sick people? It was incredible. But that 46-day strike was the beginning of 1199. And who was the workers that bore the brunt of this? Some of our comrades were involved in this. But the workers that were involved were the first time expressing their class struggle views in a tremendous industry that needed organizing. They were black, they were Latin, Latino, and they were women. And didn't this herald the future of where the labor movement would shift? The industrial sector that had been the power for the years prior, the service-oriented workers, lower paid, more oppressed, women, people of color, on the move, industrial workers on the way down. Isn't this what high-tech, low-pay is all about? So let me just end on the year 65 by this remark. In February 1965, to keep my year right, Johnson bombed North Vietnam, and the Vietnam War started, and we go into another epoch. That's it.
There's 2 hands in back. We're going to do by hands. First, I'm going to call on Bill.
Well, I was in the next generation of steel. I was in the 70s. I worked in some of the mini mills in the South that replacing the open hearth. They were replacing the basics, the large steel plants, which was also low-wage, mostly oppressed workers, where the steel was made from melting down cars and scraps into new steel, and which helped break down the USW. But as far as the post-war period, it's a lot more than the ideological and political games. It's got to be seen in this acumen of the ruling class and manipulating people. It's got to be seen in the basis, as Milt alluded to, the material basis of the time. World War II was the best thing that ever happened to U.S. imperialism, not just because of the military spending, but because it blew the rest of the world to hell. In 1946, if you wanted to buy a piece of machinery, you pretty much, outside of the Soviet bloc, which was also devastated, if you wanted to buy a piece of machinery or a car or farm machinery, you pretty much had to buy it from a U.S. company. If you wanted to borrow the money to buy it with, you had to borrow it from a U.S. bank. If you wanted to put your money, I'm talking about all over the world, you had to put it in a U.S. bank. The amount of wealth that flowed into the United States, it wasn't just that it strengthened the ruling class and that they could repress the left and the militants in the labor movement, but at the same time they could afford to make concessions to the workers, and it was worth it to them to do it. Not for everybody, and didn't mean the workers didn't have to fight. But I mean the strikes in the late 40s ended in victory for the most part. The union movement expanded. Millions of workers. It was like the changing condition for much of the U.S. working class at that time was like a socialist revolution might have made in another country, in the sense that people, for the first time got houses or cars, and we got refrigerators and indoor plumbing, and my folks had outhouses, and then I had a bath. What I mean? It's just sort of a huge material improvement just because of the wealth flowing into the country. So many GIs went to school on the GI Bill and moved in the middle class. There was easy credit. It was just it strengthened the ruling. That was the basis for the ruling class's ideological supremacy over the workers in that period. And of course, in every phenomenon, there's another phenomenon. But ironically, that inflow of wealth also ultimately paid for the high-tech revolution that's now being used to decimate and drive down the standard of living of the working class. Right now, on a much smaller scale than the 1950s, there is a new witch hunt going on in labor against supporters of the Million Worker March. And Larry and I were just at a meeting with some of the people from 1707 at Chuck Mohan's house, who was one of the two organizers, Chuck Mohan and Gloria Jackson, who were fired by the Ragland George leadership, and also Brenda. I guess people know Brenda Stokely was forced out of her job as president in a coup, illegal coup organized by the 1707 leadership, which pretended to be supporting the Million Worker March, but now is coming back for blood because. Look, if the Million Worker March had really been 500,000 people, then they would have, look what we did. But now, the Million Worker March is the ultimate sin because, like with Lewis, though at a much higher level, they tried to organize independently in the Democratic Party. They did not say labor's only hope is in the Democratic Party. And that's the ultimate crime in the minds of the this labor bureaucracy. And it's not just some even apparently progressive unions like the charges against Brenda and Gloria and Chuck are that they did too much work outside of the union in the community in anti-war work. Brenda had today a copy of AFSCME's Constitution, and it says the objectives of the union are to work for the improvement of the living standards of all the people, to work in the community, to build alliances, and to work with workers all over the world to bring up the living standards, to improve conditions for workers everywhere. That's specifically in the AFSCME Constitution. And so they're being attacked for having carried out the living spirit of that Constitution. But unlike the witch hunt in the 1950s, it's not coming at a time when standards of living are rising, when the imperialists are able to afford to make substantial concessions to the working class. It comes at a time when they're taking back and attacking labor And so this is it's a whole, and of course these leaders who are under attack are from the black community. So it's a whole different dynamic going on here. We have to get involved and help in the struggle whatever way we can. Of course, the people who are members of the union have to play the lead, but we will be called upon to help in getting out literature to the daycare centers, and maybe helping at, they're going to have a press conference. And, you know, the very day that Brenda was forced out of office, they accepted a sellout contract. The Ragland George leadership accepted a sellout contract, but it's a sellout in the context, in the type of contracts that are going around now, in that they gave what appeared to be a big raise to the workers on staff now, but without retroactivity. They've been without a contract for 4 years, but an upfront lump sum payment of a few $1,000s and a 11% raise, but a two-tier system where the new hires get paid less, get less vacation, get less sick days. So then in a few years, when it's a choice, they'll try to get rid of the older people and use the new people who have less who are both lower paid and have less loyalty to the union, because the union they don't see the union as having done something for them. And this is the kind of so it's sort of like a temporary buyout of the people who are working to intensify exploitation in the future. Those are the kind of contracts that are going around everywhere. Anyway, Congress and friends will be called upon to help in these efforts. There's going to be a ratification meeting in 3 weeks probably, and this is a big, this strikes, and this issue has been all over the papers. There will probably be an effort by the militants to do some kind of manifestation, leafleting, something at that ratification meeting, and we should be available to help with that.
Who pushed him up?
Ragland George.
Ragland George, but who was the executive director of 1707, and he actually, he came to the fundraiser for the CIU. He said,
made a great speech.
Great speech. He said, the terrorists, we're not afraid of terrorists in the Middle East. Our people in my community are afraid of the cop on the corner. And then he turned around and did this, and but it's really coming from above, from the very leadership of AFSCME, from McEntee, who are I mean, on one level, it's the personal corruption of the leadership that wants to be reelected and is afraid of the threat posed by genuine militant union leaders who are not seeking to line their pockets. But also, it comes within the context of the AFSCME leadership and the whole AFL-CIO leadership wanting revenge and wanting for the Million Worker March and wanting to crush any effort at a genuine independent unionism, as opposed to the NUP, which they could live with that. But the Million Worker March is a no-no, because it works. It says Labor's future doesn't lie in the Democratic Party; it lies in mass struggle.
Molly?
Well, it's interesting that Bill's talked about this, because those of us that work at the labor movement, I think we see there still are some vestiges from the period that Milt gave the educational event. I think even though, in the, like after the 60s and the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, there were a lot of efforts. I know AFSCME, I think, took out the loyalty oaths from their constitution. A lot of unions kind of stepped back from all of that. But the business union model that was set up never really got undone. I mean, Milt, you may want to comment a little more on this. And so there's this, and I think the AFL-CIO's foreign policy reflects that. The support for whoever's out there that's not for socialism, whoever it happens to be, but who's for bourgeois democracy, meaning leaving capitalism in place and having to fight like the workers do here for whatever contract you can get, as opposed to like what's going on in Venezuela, where they're really trying to change the whole system to benefit the workers. So there, what happened in 1707, the national union played a role in. I mean, it's not strictly just Ragland George, and it's vestiges of that bureaucracy that was left when all the radicals were kicked out of the labor movement. I've had people ask me, well, why did they have a corruption scandal down at DC 37? And I say, well, you know, if they hadn't kicked out all the radicals back in the 50s and the early 60s, you'd have people that were more interested in the workers than in taking money or whatever. You know, you'd have people that were interested in the bigger picture. And when you have a strictly business union model, that's when you run into these problems, you know, some of the problems. But I wanted to ask Milt about, I have to apologize, I came late. I had, you know, a lot of things to do today earlier. I don't know if you talked about China, but, you know, the Chinese Revolution really freaked out, you know, the ruling class. And a lot of, you know, in addition to, you know, dropping the bomb in Japan and the beginning of the Cold War, a lot of the repression had to do with
Who lost that?
staving off. Like, we cannot have, you know, lose this huge of a chunk of the world market, you know, to capitalism. And we can't have anything here in the, you know, in the U.S. or anywhere that would have potential to go that far. And just, you know, what the role of that was, because that was kind of the big international event that overshadowed the period and the Korean War. You know, it had to do with the Korean War too, and then in turn has repercussions on the domestic labor movement.
Well, let's just see if there's any other questions for Milt.
Because I'm talking about the situation in the hospitals right now. I mean, there are, you know, from Bush to Pataki to, you know, there are cuts coming. And so a lot of the, in 1199 anyway, the position of the leadership is sort of, I don't think they're corrupt or insincere. I think they're just sort of overwhelmed, and they've given up on any left perspective. So they're just sort of going along with this, like, well, cuts are inevitable, what can we do, let's try to make the best of it kind of thing. And I'm wondering, you know, I also see some similarities between the hospital industry now and what was going on in the steel industry, I guess, in those times, where the hospital industry as an industry is changing. I mean, right after World War II, it was sort of this booming industry and everyone jumped into hospitals and things. I mean, now it's more about home care, outpatient surgery. I mean, there's still a need for health care, but it's not focused so much on the hospital setting. But in all of this transition, and also high technology, I mean, they have robots now that romp around and, you know, pick up medical charts and do crazy things. So with all these changes, I mean, how can you, you know, how do you, I mean, I guess I'm sort of into like, well, I don't care, I want to fight anyway, you know. But besides that sort of gut feeling, how can you try to fight for jobs when maybe, you know, when healthcare is shifting? And how can you overcome, I guess, the demoralization, the defeatist attitude of a union leadership that's like, well, this is inevitable, let's try to just get whatever little crumbs we can, and, you know.
Yeah, same problem with the airlines.
Yeah, maybe,
Any more?
Michelle?
Two questions. The meeting, Meany made the statements that he made, that you referred to in terms of never being on a picket line. How could they still have elected him as the head of the AFL? I guess, was it really purely just that he was put in by, who was it, Eisenhower? And how, you know, I guess I don't understand that, and if it's a long answer, then, you know, you can tell me at another time. And then the other question, which is very separate, but in terms of the unions and what you mentioned about boss and subordination, how can unions, and not the fakes, because it's evident in terms of the union leadership and what's going on now with some of them and how they're pretty much weak. How can unions start, let me give this example. We were trained in business, human resources. We were taught you would think of ways to undermine unions. This is business students. You know, I went to business school. So some of your training related specifically to how can you eliminate unions? How do you get workers against unions? What about unions in terms of foresight instead of reacting? What is their strategy in terms of having a long-term strategy to foresee? Because that's what I feel now in terms of TWU when I'm listening to some of the complaints when I teach some of their classes. And all right, yes, we're losing our jobs, but you have to come with something more than saying we're losing our jobs. And I think that there's a strategy that is needed. And I guess I'm asking you what strategies could help preempt such? And yes, they will occur, but then how can they fight back? Or is it possible to do that?
And you're referring to the TWU workers, toll booth workers who are being laid off because of technology, basically,
Yes.
because of the cars. Yeah,
Yes.
because of- yeah,
Train drivers.
Yes.
right. Yeah, oh, right, and they're trying to eliminate the...
Talking booths, yes, and the computers.
Well, these are big. I'm going to take the easier one first. Let me answer Molly first on the basis of the fact that I mentioned it, but I overlooked the more depth that you raised. There's no question that I mentioned it at the opening remarks, 1949, the Chinese Revolution, was a tremendous development around that shook the world, as one of the books title was. And the impact here, combined with the Soviet Union, led to deepening the witch hunt, particularly when it developed from Truman to Eisenhower. But there was a lot of doubt in the ruling class here before Truman left office. Remember, he fired Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was the general of generals. He was the swashbuckling adventurer who can solve all the world's problems militarily. And his position was to take all the troops up to the Yalu River and cross it, thinking that China would lay down. But he lost the struggle, just like what may happen in Iraq on a different level. The Chinese Revolution had so inspired the workers and the peasants that they swept down from the Yalu River and overcame all the troops that were brought from Japan, because the war ended in Japan, but the troops didn't leave Japan. MacArthur was the signed the truce, and then he went to Japan to prepare exactly for either going against the Soviet Union, but then the Chinese Revolution developed. Now, here at home, though, it intensified the witch hunt here intensified with the Chinese Revolution to such an extent that the word brainwashing was a key word for all the troops coming home that were being brainwashed by the left, because they were disenchanted with what happened in Korea as they fled to the south. So the attacks intensified here against labor and the workers, even though, as Bill was saying, it was an expansion period, Eisenhower. You know what we used to call it in those days? 9 billionaires and a plumber. The plumber was the Secretary of Labor named Martin Durkin. He was the Secretary of Labor. See, that was Eisenhower's way of sending a message to the labor movement. You see, I'm appointing a plumber. He didn't forget that Meany was a plumber too. Meany's trade was a plumber. before he got into the AFL. So you're absolutely right. It intensified everything. See, so that it was hard for us even to function in Buffalo in regard, although we had differences with the SWP lead majority, because even in this, although we lost all our fractions in Westinghouse where Dorothy Ballin was, in Steel where Vinnie got fired in 49, and I think it's in one of the pamphlets, thousands supported Vinnie, didn't even know what a Trotskyite was. They said, Vinnie's a good American, he talks English. What's a Trotskyite? Never heard of. That's how the workers looked. They didn't look at you like you were some language, some like way out in Russia. They worked with you. They saw what you did during the day in and day out and day in and day out. But we couldn't run for office. Every time I went down to the Union Hall, they'd pull out the loyalty thing. You want to sign it? Your name is here. We know your background. Couldn't run for office. Couldn't. So it's true. The Chinese Revolution had a big effect. It will play out in this century, believe me. China has now emerged as the second power beyond Japan, and even trades with Japan more than the U.S. trades with Japan right now. So it's an incredible development for us if we want to look at the optimistic side, although there are problems. I think Deirdre wrote an excellent article, and we should look particularly on the Walmart as an example, that they have a union. Now, in regard to the hospital crisis, which we should talk more about this, but it's inconceivable to me, and I could be wrong yet, that the development in the hospitals will follow the same development in steel. The reason why it won't, even though the technology has played an important role in this, is that the steel industry, on the basis of its technology, putting just the industry out front, the overproduction in the steel industry was incredible. We could produce steel under the new technology at such a rate of production that it would glut the markets, right, overproduction right away, that we'd get laid off for a certain amount of months. And the competition between these giants began to take its toll as to who survives in a shrinking, overproduced market. And as Bill says, the mini mills began to grow. Hospitals, they provide a service. How could the hospitals overproduce? How could the hospitals create a commodity? I'm sorry?
Well, they have empty beds.
But the patients, the workers who need health care, that's the decisive factor. See, in the changing relationship of class forces is care, hospital care. They can't so easily destroy Medicare right now, even though it provides for the seniors. The potential of a union and community, and by the way, that's the history of 1199. See, when Bill was talking about the Constitution of District Council 37 or 1707, look at the question of hospitals, see, and nursing homes. You see, they cannot ultimately destroy an instrument of cure, whether it's a hospital or a clinic or whatever. Why? Is because the masses won't tolerate it. See, when the 1199 was organized, who was one of the leaders who was not in 1199? Davis was the president. Benjamin, what's the name? Leon Davis. By the way, coming out of the CP, too. And left the CP. You know who was one of the major supporters and benefactors of 1199? Was Martin Luther King. And why did Martin Luther King look at 1199 differently? And this is a lesson, see. King looked at 1199 because he saw the merger of the civil rights movement with the labor movement. See, this was a very important development that started back in '59 and was all part of the development of the civil rights movement. 1199 was part of it, and it should never lose its history. Why? Look what happened in 1963 in the March on Washington, led by King. 1199 are the benefactors of all this. If they maintain their history, which has to be renewed by who? Nina and Ann and all the progressives, see, that are still somewhere floating around. They're not that old that they don't remember the history, and then you had more strikes. I only gave the one in '59. 1199 is a future, notwithstanding the maneuvering of the leaders now and the development of Rivera trying to be straddling Pataki and his union. He'll split over it. You know, you straddle your legs so far, and you can't do a split, something breaks. He ain't that agile. And as the struggle deepens, their agility gets lesser, believe me. Now, the other tough one, part of it anyway. The reason George Amini became president of the AFL-CIO is due to a couple of things. First, the CIO got weaker, much weaker during the splits and the losses and the resignations that took place in the CIO, and it's even as a later date of 1955 when the merger took place. The AFL was elevated during those years as a more conservative, craft-type, white aristocracy. Exists now. See? The changing relationship of class forces, and we hope, I know Sharon is thinking about it, and Molly was thinking about it, and we should talk more about it later, about a high-tech, low-pay look at how to renew it on another level, since it's, how many years now since Sam wrote it?
About 18 years.
About 18 years. But it was the CIO, the weakness of the CIO. The AFL was elevated, and Meany was president of the AFL. George Meany at the time was the president of the AFL. And Ruther, who could have made a bid for presidency, didn't have the base anymore that he had in steel and auto. And also, John L. Lewis had disappeared from the scene. And John L. Lewis was playing a different kind of role out of frustration and anger. He made one last effort to unite an independent labor movement separate from the AFL-CIO. It was called the American Labor Alliance in 1954, I believe, where he was able to bring together the Teamsters, the UAW, and one other union that slips my mind, and start another independent union. But he had lost it by that time. And really, the Teamsters was a maneuver, see, to try to avoid the merger of the AFL-CIO, and it failed. Teamster went back later on, because Meany's position that developed while he was president of the AFL-CIO was that the communists were more threatening than all the corruption that existed in the labor movement. And what Meany did was bring back the Teamsters that had been thrown out of the AFL in the earlier days. So the AFL-CIO, while numerically it potentially got stronger, and numerically got stronger, and it stopped to a large extent in recent years the ratings and so on that were encouraged under the previous laws like the Taft-Hartley and others, and solved a lot of those problems. They haven't really dealt with the struggle. So as a result of that, the AFL-CIO plodded along, losing, retrenching, until now, when there's a big development and the party will have to analyze it more carefully, and that is the breaks that are beginning to be not splits, I use my words carefully, breaks within the AFL-CIO that has great potential but also dangers. See? And we're going to have to analyze it, and we're going to have to examine it, because it's a timely, it has possibilities. See? And of course, in my opinion, to throw in with Bill, what Bill is talking about, the Million Worker March, as small as it was, the AFL-CIO, in its disarray right now, has a great potential. See, notwithstanding the loss of Brenda and a few of the others in District 1707. I don't know all that's going on, but I do know one thing. 1707 is one of the weakest district councils in the entire country. My judgment, I don't even know why it exists. It should really have arisen into DC 37 in some form, simply because they deal with non-profit type private sector workers, and DC 37 is all public sector unions. That's a separation that's artificial. They may lose more if time goes by as an isolated district council, see, on the basis of losing Brenda Stokely and some of the more developed leaders that have a view, a vision, a perspective. See, Raglan George is notwithstanding the great speech he made, he's a hands-on business guy, you know, union type of guy that came up and took over the leadership of 1707. There's great opportunities. The workers have not suffered a serious defeat. They've suffered a setback with the Bush administration. That's different than a defeat. When workers suffer a defeat, they're routed, retreat. Like the PATCO was a defeat. It wasn't just a setback for that particular union. It dissolved. And they had to regroup, and they come back now with another union. There's another type union. As long as capitalism exists, Marx said, there will be collective workers in some formation, like a union, that will resist exploitation. You can bring robots, you can bring all you want, but robots do not create value. Once it's built, it becomes dead capital. And you cannot suck anything out. But a worker, you can lose surplus value with a worker. You can create the profits and the value from a worker. And the more robots and technology that exists, the change in the structure of a corporation from variable capital to fixed capital, see, as Marx points out, reduces the rate of profit of a corporation. It sows the seeds of their own downfall, but that doesn't give us a solution yet. See, a solution. But let's know what the problems are. Let's know what the problems of the bosses are in the ruling class, see, in the light of this particular epoch. I wrote an article this week. I don't know if comrades had a chance, but there's no question. I had a headline and I changed it. I was going to say the sun is setting in this financial empire, like in Britain. But I decided maybe it's a little premature. But it is. However, it is.
Very good article.
See, it is. And so we have to first examine the class relationships and then regroup for our own perspective, which is a revolutionary process for a socialism. There's no other way out of this. And imperialism is weaker. It is. It's more powerful militarily as a superpower. But you cannot dominate the globe with an economy that has deep contradictions in it. They cannot. They need the logistics. Just like an organization. We have writers, we have organizers, we have those who know how to do sound, we know organizers. That's what a party builds. See? And that is the future, the party. See, based on a Leninist conception, a Marxist-Leninist conception. But we gotta reach the workers. We gotta find a way. I'm so pleased to hear about your report at the subways. See, we have to know, and how we build a million worker march to become the true left wing of this disarrayed AFL-CIO is a real challenge for us. And this was a setback to some extent. Clarence Thomas lost the election, but it freed him. He's running all over the country now. See? There's dialectics to this. See? If he was working, if he was president of the union, like, what's his name, who's his co-thinker, who is now president, slight my mind when names. No, in Local 10 of the ILW, Trent Willis. He's tied down. He got to pay attention to his members and the business unionism. Business unionism, and by the way, we should look at business unionism in kind of a more comprehensive way. Of course we're opposed to business unionism.
Define it.
Business unionism, well, first let me put it in the perspective and then let's define it.
I don't know what it means.
Business unionism is a term. And what it is, first and foremost, is to see that the system ties up the unions. You cannot fill out a form under the Taft-Hartley and the later one, the Landreth-Griffin, in which the Department of Labor, with the thousands of employees, don't hang on every form you send in, how much money this, how much for dues, how much for this. Monthly, they're on top of you. And I notice Marsh waving ahead because there was a little struggle that broke out in the AFT, right? The AFT wasn't? Where you had to be on the ball. You had to spend days straightening out the books. Why? Because someone was coming in to look at the books. So it ties you up. See? I get calls from the president of the Steelworkers, who's a comrade. They're calling them all the time. We want to see the books now. See why? It's because the union is on the offensive in the struggle in the city. So, got to put that into the perspective. You can't break As long as capitalism exists, they got to be bookkeepers, accountants, and a whole slew of staffs, so that you don't get sued for damages under I don't know how many laws that exist. However, there's another side to business unionism, see? And this is the side that we should be able to sort of understand and see how we can get involved with this. What is it basically? When we started these classes, one of the things that we raised from very early in looking over the history of labor, how can the labor movement become independent and separate itself politically and economically to some extent in terms of conflict, class struggle, strikes? How to be able to separate it? See, the unions during the Wallace campaign in 1948 against that Truman eased out, that's where they were going. So if there's a perspective of independent class-wide politics, that the vision, the Million Worker March, that's the vision of it, is to build an independent movement. Then the question comes up, if you do that, then the business-type unionism that exists within the union movement changes the balance of power between those leaders, those, quote, bureaucrats. And by the way, the word bureaucracy is not a bad word. It's how bureaucracy is interpreted. We got to have a staff. We don't call them bureaucrats, do we? But got a lot of headaches of how the bills get paid, see, and how the headquarters gets heated, and how the lights are on, and who pays it, and how the rent gets paid. See, do I worry about that? No. See, I mean, we have a staff. See, well, the unions have staffs, but you see, what's happened is, around business unionism has created class collaboration. Class collaboration. See, how to work within the framework of capitalist law and the practices and patterns that exist over the years between labor and management. Arbitration. Bringing the government in on everything from organizing a union. You've got to go through the National Labor Relations Board, card sign. All this is happened to the labor movement. And the practices that come out of class collaboration has deepened and deepened. Old habits die hard. And these leaders cannot unravel themselves. They can talk structure, but once the workers begin to move, and we're seeing signs of it, rumbles of it. See, Sharon Black wrote a great article on the hotel settlement in Washington. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some criticism of that article from ultra-leftism, see. But what was the importance of that development, in my opinion? And Sharon wrote it, so the rank and file were ready to strike the Bush inauguration. They were. They had been out on the streets for weeks while the hotel employers were stonewalling everything. See? They had monopolies. You're not going to tell us what to do. See? That's what happened. They're all monopolies. But they began to see it was January 15th, 5 days away from the inauguration, a $40-50 million shameless Bush. See, hey, let's get them back to the table. See, what do they want that we can give them? So they got what they wanted. No concessions, no two-tierism. They pretty much got a wage increase. They got new productivity levels, which is very important. Hotel women that worked the rooms, why they were whipped into how many beds they had to set. These are important developments, as I pointed out during the Second World War, what the workers had to go through. See, they got security on all that, plus some wage increases. That's what you get. But what's the lesson of it? The lesson of it is timing. Timing. See, when to strike them, when to hit them. See, they shudder if the timing is in our favor, in our class favor, in the workers' favor. I didn't report on the number of strikes that in my talk. There was a strike in Wisconsin where McCarthy came out of, Joseph McCarthy. It was called the Kohler Plumbing Corporation. 4 years they were out on strike. 4 years. And then they got broke. The UAW was broken. Time. See? The witch hunt, the McCarthy period, the whole thing came down on these workers, 3,500 workers. And Brian Pfeiffer's family is from Wisconsin. He wants a write on it, a history of it. So that's a lesson for us, see? Timing. And also organizing. The workers were ready. They were. They voted overwhelmingly for the settlement, sure. But if they didn't get it, well, you'd have seen those hotels shut down and management wouldn't be making beds, that's for sure. Now finally this though, there are those who are going to say, well, you lost the expiration date though. You see, all of the promises that were made that in San Francisco and LA and New York, it would all end, it would all come together. That would have been good, but it wouldn't have been decisive. In steel, our expiration dates were always the same. Same in the UAW, although they have a strategy of picking one off to get a contract in terms of the weaker ones, usually Chrysler. But it would have been good, but not to get it and put a damper on this understanding would have been bad, wouldn't have been good. So, and then the final point that I want to make about business unionism is the word democracy. Now, the rank and file don't have many ways to exert their democratic rights within the labor movement. And best example of it in a specific sense is the Teamsters for Democratic Union that have been fighting for 1979 or thereabouts when it was formed to find some form of democracy within the union. And that's worth fighting for. But you cannot have democracy in the trade union movement. You cannot unless you free every progressive and communist who declares their communism, who declares their class struggle beliefs, to be free to join a union leadership, to fight to become the leadership of a union, to build caucuses, fractions, whether they're black, Latino, or women. That's democracy. Without that, everything goes the way we discussed today, where communism got wiped out, we got wiped out from the labor movement in the earlier 50s. We had caught fractions of the party in steel, in auto, in Westinghouse, in Bell. So this is business unionism in a more comprehensive way of understanding it, and the dilemma that the labor movement faces with leaders who capitulate in terms of class collaboration. See, that's the key to it all. That's the difference between the 30s and the evolution that we described up until now, till 65. What was it? It was class struggle versus class collaboration. That's what it was. The workers will be there, but they aren't in leadership. See, I'll end on this. Workers, there is no question, workers are loyal to their unions. They are 150% loyal to their unions. But the problem is, at this point, is they haven't yet differentiated between that loyalty and the policies of their leadership. It's a dilemma. See, if you fight the leaders, maybe that's you're weakening, the union. See, you see. So we have to begin to find a way, and I think we can do it. The party is stronger. Our collective experience is on a higher level, and through some political struggle. It won't come economically, in my opinion. But every economic struggle, whether it's over wages, working conditions that lead to a strike or not a strike, in this contemporary epoch of imperialism, is tied to politics. You cannot have a strike, you cannot have a struggle on an economic level unless it becomes politicized immediately. Immediately. In the West Coast, when the ILWU, that's all right, that's okay. This is off the cuff, off the record, because I couldn't write this if I could. I mean, later on. See, few
seconds.
You decide, if you don't mind.
What?
I think it would be important actually.
Ina is saying the social contract is over. The labor management cooperation, it's over. It doesn't exist now. All the labor leaders talked about the social contract for years and years and years. Where is the social contract today? It doesn't exist. The war is on. The regroupment is necessary. See, but it's just beginning, the regroupment. It took years for the CIO to develop from the early 19th century, 20th century to the CIO of the 30s. But events are moving faster now. They are. Events change from day to day. After 1960, when Vinny wrote the last thing he did, he wrote this market elections, He said, after 1960, he said, there's never going to be an election that's normal, a bourgeois election. See, after 1960. And what happened? 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Okay. And since then, it's all shifted into cliques, small groups that point their candidates from the highest of the finance corporations and companies and bankers and so on. The masses are not involved in the election, except they do go to vote, because what the hell? They have no other choice in their minds yet. See? But even that's becoming discredited. But the point I was making before about economics and politics merging together, the ILW decided that they had to, on the basis of technology and containerization and a whole slew of the way the logistics of transportation occurs, all the way from where it's put on a ship and brought to this country, and how it's taken off a ship, and from a ship into a warehouse, and then a driver takes it out and takes it to their destination. It's all high tech, and it's all based upon a low level of inventories. So all they got to do is look at some kind of a tag now. At least Walmart's figuring that all out, and the tagging will tell you in the container where the hell it's going. Nevertheless, when the ILW was trying to restructure the technology for the contract, and they were having a hell of a time, they decided that they might take a strike vote. But the companies talk about the social contract. What the PMA did, the Pacific Maritime Association, which is the bosses for all the shipping and transportation, even the railroads, in scheduling, decided that they didn't want to talk to them. So they locked them out. They locked out the ILW. So the ILW said, okay, let the stuff pile up. Meanwhile, the war was on, or the preparation. So I think the war was on, not the, it wasn't Iraq yet. But nevertheless, the government had to come in, and they had to use the Taft-Hartley. Now, how do you use a Taft-Hartley?
When was this, 2002?
Yeah. Was it 2002?
It was right before they were about to attack Iraq. Because I remember you said they gave in. That was the Charleston Five.
Yeah, Charleston Five.
Because they were getting ready to really
Right.
go into Iraq.
Right. This is the West Coast. It's a little
Yeah,
different,
yeah. Oh,
but it
okay.
came at the same. Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying.
But anyway, can you imagine they used the Taft-Hartley not on a strike? It was based on a lockdown. The companies had locked, and they were indicting an injunction against the workers who had nothing to do with striking and lockout. The point I'm making is that they don't care what it is. You know, it's the old story we talk about when a cop is beating workers, and one of the workers says, but I'm not an anti-communist. Cop says, I don't care what kind of communist you are. I mean, that's the way they are now. That's the way the Bush administration is. See, you know, it's like I get the feeling, of course, you got to be careful. I mean, they are a monster, and they do have power, and we don't want to limit them to their stupidity. But that's what we need to analyze and be able to craft, like we're doing. The March 19th, which is so important. If the March 19th could be the launching of the party in a way that looked good on when we were part of ANSA. This is the real thing. This is the real thing, because it's the party. We weren't. The ANSA, it was shaky right along without, and Larry and Tedesser and others will have been reporting on it for a time. So that's the perspective. See, that we're going into now uncharted waters, but there's a vacuum out there. There is. The labor movement is in disarray. The Social Democrats are arguing among themselves, different wings of them. The AFL-CIO don't know what the leadership, don't know where to go with this yet. The party is ready. See? What we need to reach the workers, and sometimes what happens to comrades or friends like Brenda, Larry Adams lost his position. is that they free themselves up and they still have influence. See, you cannot buy credibility. You cannot unless you create credibility. Brenda Stokes, Raglan George, and then I don't know the whole story, but they don't have the credibility that Brenda Stokely has, and you cannot. That's a price you have to earn through years of struggle and leadership. And that doesn't go away by the loss of a formal position alone, although that helps if she did maintain a leadership role, because being president of a union, hey, you get to say, you get into different doors and say things. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, I want to thank, everybody should thank John for taking